Hi, everyone. Please find a seat. Thank you all for coming to the research paper presentations. Just a note, at the end of each of the presentations, there's going to be a question and answer session, and if you have a question, please go to the microphone at the back of the room and ask your question there. Our next speaker is Matt Goldman. Matt is an economics PhD student at the University of California, San Diego. His research in his PhD program is centered around econometrics and game theory. Today, he will be speaking with us about the research that he did with his co-author Justin Rao on the impact of pressure on performance. To hear about what makes some players choke under pressure, I'll turn it over to Matt Goldman.
All right, so I'd like to apologize to all the Matt Goldman fans. I'm actually Justin Rao, but Matt's going to be up here in 10 minutes. We're splitting this. One of the first talks today, Mark Bashuk thanked his mother. I've never seen someone do that in an academic talk. I thought that was completely awesome, and this is a webcast, so Mummy, thank you. You're awesome. All right, and Daddy, you're kind of cool too. Okay, so today we're going to talk about effort, concentration, and pressure. So I start out with observations about human psychology. And we know that human psychology is going to give you insight into sports psychology because out in the court, there's just still people, right? And so we start with this question, which is, how does pressure impact performance? Whether it's NBA basketball shooting, a surgeon in the operating room, you at your job, you on the first tee of the golf course, how does pressure impact performance? Is there a differential impact of pressure depending on the kind of thing you're doing, right? So are some tasks really responsive to pressure in a negative or positive way and other tasks not responsive? That's an interesting question from a human psychology point of view. It's definitely interesting from a sports standpoint. Is there more pressure in front of a supportive versus adversarial audience? So if you guys all wanted me to succeed, would I find that to be more pressure inducing than if you were all a bunch of haters? I don't know. That's kind of a question we're going to address. And in the realm of sports, is this notion of home choke real? So some of you might be familiar with the idea that, English golfers have done exceptionally poorly in the British Open over the past 100 years. And the implication might be that playing in front of your home crowd, that home golf course, is very difficult. So you choke on your home course. With golf, it's hard to really amass. You really have only one or two English golfers every year, or kind of zero that have a chance at winning. And so it's kind of hard to amass the data. In NBA, we can get a lot more data. So resting on the psychology literature, I'm a behavioral economist, and motivating this from a psychological point of view, psychologists point to two key reasons pressure can impact performance in a negative way. The first is what they call increased self-focus. Now, self-focus, if you intuitively think about it, is thinking about what you're doing in a way that is disruptive to performance. It's sort of the anti-Nike. Instead of just doing it, you're thinking, take the club back straight through, over the head, lock the arm, go through. And when you do that, you tend to hit the hosel and the ball goes 10 yards, right? So when you really analyze and sort of break down a task into its individual procedural elements and think about those very hard, performance can decline. And this can happen too to kids that learn how to do algebra. They follow a cookbook and they kind of cross up the steps in the cookbook. When pressure increases, they're more likely to cross those steps up. Another hypothesis is that there's simply increased distraction. So the way you do things is through your working memory. Your working memory is pretty small. So it's hard to memorize a 10-digit number. It's almost impossible for most people to do. But a 2-digit number is pretty easy. So if you're distracted, some of your mental resources might be thinking about the pressure of the moment and take you away from actually being able to perform. Okay? So these are two competing hypotheses. The evidence from sports science and psychology tends to point to increased self-focus as leading to a deterioration in performance under pressure. The prediction this makes is that performance should be impacted negatively in tasks or situations in professional sports where self-focus can creep in. So in this paper, we're going to talk about two separate tasks, one where self-focus is really going to play a prominent role, and another where it's not. Some evidence of why distraction is not what's driving a deterioration in performance is the standard psychological paradigm is to pull a bunch of people into a lab or go to a golf course and you say something like, putt these golf balls and I'll pay you $1 for every one you make. Okay, that's good. Now, I'm going to pay you $15 for every one you make. So now the pressure has gone up by 15. The monetary stakes has gone up by a lot. If you intentionally distract people while they're doing this, they tend to do better under pressure. So if you make them call out a random letter every 10 seconds, it's pretty annoying to do C, F, You have to do that, and if you don't do that, you don't get paid. It's kind of annoying to have to do that. Doing that tends to lead to better performance. The reason being is it's harder to think about what you're doing when you have to do this other thing. And under pressure, that can actually improve your performance. Now, if you're on the golf tee at your club, at the public course, what I do is I sing a song to myself. That helps me on the first tee. And so distracting yourself can actually sometimes improve performance, indicating that it's not the reason that performance deteriorates. Really, it's the self-focus, at least for tasks where self-focus can creep in. Some other evidence from psychology is that supportive crowds in a lot of settings generally inspire effort. So if there's a lot of people there supporting me, I try harder. Now, whether trying harder is good or not might depend on the task at hand, but I do try harder. So if you're running the 400 meters in the Olympics, you're going to do a little better if you're running in front of your home crowd. You're going to try a little harder, something kind of brings something out in you. That's the idea from these psychology studies. However, supportive crowds might also apply more pressure because of what we call the disappointment effect. Imagine doing something in front of all your friends and relatives where if you make the shot, they all win $100. That's kind of hard to do, right? They're all looking at you, they want you to succeed, they're pulling for you, but they're also gonna be really disappointed if you don't make it. Versus an adversarial audience, they're not all applying that sort of human element of pressure. The question we're gonna address is, do these results that it does seem true among college undergraduates looking to make an extra buck for their studies, do these results generalize to highly incentivized experts? And here we're talking about NBA players. So this paper is going to use a large data set of the last 5 years of game logs, includes over 350,000 free throws and 1.3 million possessions. We're going to empirically quantify the importance of each point to give a measure of pressure. So we're going to say, at any given situation of the game, how much does a point change my chance of winning the game? If that value is high, that's a high pressure moment. If that value is low, if it's 0, it's garbage time. And if it's low, it's a regular moment or a non-clutch moment. We'll call it a non-clutch moment. And like I said, the evidence indicates that depending on the task at hand, pressure might have a differential effect. So we're going to look at 2 completely different tasks. One is free throw shooting. Free throw shooting requires quiet concentration, right? You're sitting there, you're shooting at your own timed pace, and you're the only person with the ball. Offensive rebounding requires effort. It's done in the heat of the moment. You have no time to contemplate or think or overanalyze. You're just doing it, right? It turns out that a free throw is worth 1 point. That's obvious. Grabbing an offensive rebound in the NBA is actually worth, on average, about 1 point. So they're comparable in terms of the stakes. So we wanted 2 things that have comparable stakes, but differential effort versus concentration. So I'm going to take you through how we quantify pressure. A basketball game is a series. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to skip to the graph because I know it's hard to see equations from up there. What we do is what other papers have done today. You say, take any game situation, say you're down by 3 with 2 minutes left. Compare that to a situation where you're down by 2 with 2 minutes left. How much does your chance of winning the game go up? Well, if it goes up by 10%, that point is worth 10 percentage points, say. That's a high importance point. Take a situation where you're down by 15 with 6 minutes left. If you score being down by 14 or being down by 15 with that much time left, you win the game about the same amount of time. The point is worth very little. So what I'm showing you here is a graph of the first 3 quarters of the game. You have the minutes remaining coming towards you, and on the other x-axis you have the home team's lead. So that spine is at margin of 0. The game is tied. What you see is that on that spine, the value of points increases as you go towards the end of the game, and at the end of the 3rd quarter in a tie game for evenly matched teams, you see that each point increased the team's chance of winning by 4 percentage points. Okay? So quite a bit. If we look at the 4th quarter, we see that the axis scale has changed. This starts out where the other graph left off at the front, and we see at the end of the 4th quarter, points are worth an incredibly large amount, but there's a lot of flat spot, right? Because if the margin is 7 or 8 with 1 minute left, the game is sort of out of reach. So we see a lot of flat spots in the 4th quarter, but a lot of high value spots too. And what this graph will do is you can look at any given combination of margin and time remaining. This is in the paper, it's for any given matchup is done based on the team characteristics, but this is a generic case. And you'd say, how much does each point change my chance of winning the game? That's the importance of the point. That's what we'll measure as the importance of the point. So we're going to use that value as importance of the point to say, here's how much pressure is associated with that point, because it's how much the point changes my chance of winning the game. So what I'm going to do now is hand it over to Matt Goldman, who you've heard a lot about before, and there's a lot of Matt Goldman fans here, and he's going to take you through the results.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Justin. So now that we have this great, technical difficulties. So now that we have this really nice metric that tells us exactly how much a point is worth in all kinds of different situations across the game, what we want to do is we want to take that metric and look at player performance in our two tasks, our effort task of rebounding and our concentration task of free throw shooting, and see how performance in those tasks tends to be correlated with the overall pressure of the moment. Right, and so the first thing we're going to look at is rebounds, which we think of as very much of an effort task, a situation when you're really motivated, when you really want it more, you're going to fight harder, you're going to fight for position, you're going to get that extra rebound when you might not have otherwise. And basically what we find is statistically significant improvement for the home team in terms of offensive rebounding rate in clutch situations. So when the stakes are high, you're in front of your home fans, you really, really want to win the game, so you don't let them down, you fight harder, your offensive rebound rate actually increases from a baseline of about 29%, all the way up to 33%. So here what you see is you see a kernel smoothing of that data, and what you see is that when the value of a point, at the end of a fourth quarter, when there's a 20-point game, the value of a point is nothing. In those situations, the home and the away team do just about the same in terms of getting a rebound. But progressively, as the value of a point increases more and more, what you see is a very significant and steady rise in terms of the home team's offensive rebounding rate. And by that I mean the percentage of available rebounds secured by the offensive team. But similarly, when you look at the green line, you see a very steady line. Basically nothing is going on there. It looks maybe like a little bit of an increase towards the end, but in aggregate, there really is no increase in the away team offensive rebounding rate that we can find, right? So the pressure mounts, the home team gets motivated, maybe the away team does too, but the home team gets more motivated, and their offensive rebounding rate progressively increases while the away team's doesn't really, okay? So by contrast, what we want to do is we want to compare that to a totally different task, a task of free throw shooting, where it's not so obvious that fighting hard and really wanting it more is going to lead you to perform better. So free throw shooting is very much of a concentration task, and we have the idea, as Justin was talking about, the people who really want to make the free throw are going to want it too much, and they're going to focus on all the little P's and Q's and all the little things they know they're supposed to do as a free throw shooter, and like the infamous John Starks, they may end up choking. And actually what we find is statistically significant evidence to show that across all 350,000 of our free throws and across all 441 players in the NBA, on average, there is a significant decline in performance at the foul line in clutch situations. However, conversely, away shooters actually do not show any impact of the increased pressure of the moment, and they actually seem to show a slight improvement. So basically just breaking down the regression coefficients very quickly so you see what we're doing is actually significant. When we average over all the players, and again, we do this analysis individually for each player, right? We look at each individual player, we look at how he does in the clutch moments and in not so clutch moments. And for individual players, our analysis tends to be kind of noisy. But again, aggregating over all those players, what we find are clear relationships where when you're at home, you see statistically the home team in general in non-clutch situations shoots statistically better from the free throw line. You could think of that as sort of a generic home field advantage. But then in the clutch situations, you again see a very statistically significant decline. And sort of to visualize that in a way you guys can understand, we sort of picked a typical moderately clutch situation, right? We picked a situation where the win value of a point, right, the amount that a point would increase your probability of winning is about 8 percentage points. So that should say 0.08. And in that kind of a situation, we took our coefficients from the previous slide, and what we're able to say is that, so in the, for the away team, we do see a slight advantage. We're going from an away regular situation to a home regular situation. We do see that the home team in general does shoot free throws a little bit better than the away team, but looking specifically at the clutch situation, we see the picture completely reversed. And this is a very big discrepancy where in clutch situations, the home team really kind of shrinks, they get nervous, whatever, their free throw percentage goes way down, and the away team isn't really affected. And so when you look at, when you look at the home versus the away, what's going on, again, you see that small improvement for the away team, but when you look at how the home team does from their normal advantage in non-clutch situations to their disadvantage in clutch situations, you see a huge discrepancy, and really it looks like they're losing about 2 percentage points on their free throw percentage, and that can obviously be really significant, and that's obviously something that home teams would want to avoid. All right, so moving on, obviously this is great. We've shown that overall, on average, over all the players in the league, there is this kind of average choking going on, where players seem to be doing a little bit worse. But this doesn't really answer the most interesting question that a lot of fans care about, which is maybe who was a choker? Who's clutch, who's a choker? I watch this guy play, and I always think he shrinks in the clutch. And so I think a really good question is, how well can you tell that from the data? And so the first thing we did is we looked at all the players in our data set, and we tried to say, does it look like different guys are different? Can we see in a significant way that one player might be clutch and another player is a choker? And we looked over all 441 players in our sample. Sorry, that's a typo. And we found 25 guys who at a 5% level really look like they're different from the group mean. And if you guys know much about statistics, you know that's not a huge surprise. When you look at a large sample of players and you find that a few guys are different from the group mean, that's not a huge surprise. That's not very significant. Manu Ginobili was sort of the one guy in our sample who really sort of seemed to stick out a little bit. You know, his T statistic on him being the same as everyone else was like a 3.68. So there's a very, very low chance that if we were just analyzing Manu Ginobili, that would happen by chance. Obviously, it's worth remembering that we actually analyzed tons and tons of players. The fact that you get one guy like Manu Ginobili is a little bit of a coincidence, but it's not completely implausible. And finally, one thing we did notice is just sort of looking in aggregate over all of our free throw shooters, guys who choked did look a little bit like they were correlated with guys who were not good free throw shooters. So the Shaqs and the Ben Wallaces of the world looked a little bit more susceptible to choking than the Steve Nashes and the Ray Allens of the world. But again, and while that's statistically significant, even at 0.5% level, it was not super predictive in telling us exactly who was going to clutch, who was going to choke, and who was clutch. So really the question, and again, here's the table of the 25 guys who I told you were statistically different from the mean. You guys can see that in the paper. Obviously, you see Manu Ginobili up there, Robert Horry, perhaps another interesting name showing up as a statistically significant clutch player. But I would caution you guys against putting too much interpretation, putting too much stock in exactly what this looks like. Because what you see is you see lots of noise, right? We only see an individual player shoot so many free throws. And based on that sampling variability and how they do on the free throws we actually see, you know, there could be a lot of noise in our estimate of how clutch they are. And so what we really want to do is we want to work backwards from all these noisy estimates like this and take into account the sampling variability. And we want to tell you guys, should you really believe that there's a lot of variability in who's clutch? Is it really reasonable for me to believe that player X is really, really clutch and is going to pull it off in crunch time, but player Y is always going to choke? Or should I admit that probably my perception of that is really colored by the small sample size that I saw them play in? And so in order to try to answer that, we're sort of going to do this procedure where we're going to try and difference out the sampling variability. We're going to look at how much variability there was in these estimates in the previous table. We're going to look at how much variability there would be just from random noise. And if there's excess variability left over, we're going to say that's true heterogeneity. That's a true sense in which different players must be different to account for all the excess variability that we see here. So we do that, and we do some fancy, boring math stuff. But basically, the conclusion we get back to is if we go back to that example of a situation where the game is tied and there are 3 minutes left, and 1 point is worth about 0.08 wins, or 8% of a win, we can say that in that kind of a situation, based on what we think the distribution of our clutch parameters are, that it's very implausible that there are a whole lot of guys who see more than a 5% drop or more than a 3% increase in their free throw percentage. There could be a few, and obviously our ability to model this is not perfect. But just in general, that while it looks like on average, guys do see a 1% or 2% decrease in their free throw percentage, and it looks like there is some variability where it's plausible to believe that some guys are chokers and some guys are really clutch. There's just not a whole lot in the data to support the idea that some guys are always going to pull it out, and some guys are just doomed in clutch situations. So again, thank you for listening to our presentation. Just really quickly to sum up where we've been through. We're looking at the impact of pressure and how that correlates with two key factors, obviously home versus away, and also concentration versus an effort task. And basically, to sum up our findings, we find that home players sort of seem to choke in these concentration tasks, but when they're really fired up, they do better on the effort tasks like rebounding. Away players do not seem to be significantly impacted by pressure. And these results are consistent with the psychological idea that Justin was talking about players having too much self-focus as a reason for choking under pressure. But at the same time, in non-clutch situations, they are kind of consistent with the notion of home field advantage. All right, thank you for your time.
So he said to make sure to come to the mic for questions, which is here. Or just go to the door.
For the free throws and the clutch notion, are you going to factor in the amount of free throws that the players are taking to give us a better accurate? You know, some guys are always taking, getting fouled at the end, or other guys maybe only do it once every 10 games.
Sure. So that feature would not affect the results because what we're doing is everything on an individual player-by-player basis. So it's not going to be the case that the fear would be there's some selection issues. So at the end of games, free throws get made more. It's not because players are getting better, it's because better players are taking free throws. So that's not going to come into it because we're doing all the analysis on an individual player, and we're saying, does this player, at all points in the game, clutch and non-clutch, how does his performance change with the clutchness? And then we're aggregating the results across players to present them in graphs and so forth. So that's not going to affect the results, but I can't tell you off the top of my head how much selection there is. My intuition is that late in games, better players tend to shoot more free throws because they handle the ball more and they get fouled in important situations.
And just one important thing to add is obviously there are many guys who don't shoot a whole lot of free throws. And I've been talking about sampling variability as a huge confound to our ability to really tell who's clutch and who's not clutch. And obviously for those guys who only shoot a few free throws, we can get crazy estimates. And we know that, right? That's reflected in our standard errors. And we're not going to make any bold statements about a guy being clutch or a choker based on a small sample size of shots.
So in your model, you seem to value very close difference in the points at the end of the game. But frequently in games, you'll have players miss free throws on purpose. Do you capture this in your model?
So they might, I wouldn't say this happens frequently. I'd say this happens very, very rarely. So like say you're down by 2 with like 2 seconds left. Actually being down by 2 with 2 seconds left, I mean, an intentional miss, we can check. Hopefully, in terms of the results, as long as it doesn't differentially happen home versus away, it won't affect the results we present here today. But we can certainly check if there's any outliers just to remove. That's a good point.
Hi. I was wondering if you could clarify the rebound statistic, because it looks as if when you sum the home percentage and the away percentage, it doesn't come to 1, and it increases over time. So does that mean that there are a larger number of players at the beginning of the game under low pressure situations, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I can clarify that. So the home line would be happening on the home team's offensive end. The away line would be happening on the away team's offensive end, and the remainder would be the defensive rebound. So it's sort of a zero-sum game. So we can't, hypotheses that revolve around, presumably both teams are trying harder. All we can say is that differentially, the home team is getting on top of that. You know, they're trying harder than the away team's trying harder, but presumably both. Similarly with Manu Ginobili, he does show up as a clutch player. Now the question would be, is he upping his performance in clutch moments, or is he just not concentrating in non-clutch moments? All we see is a difference. So we interpret that. Natural interpretation is that's clutch. But of course, if you're the coach, you know more than we do. You might say, actually, you know, he just doesn't try. But most NBA players want to score points, so it's easy to do. So we don't think that, but that is a criticism you could levy. Next question, please.
Did you consider that the noise from fans calling out from the stands for the home team might be the pure distraction versus psychological pressure?
Yeah, okay, so I think it's a good question. So the two differences between a home shooter and an away shooter is that the home shooter, both the people around him support him, and they're being very, very quiet. An away shooter, the people around him typically do not support him, and they're going completely crazy. What we can say is that going completely crazy does not affect these guys at all. They do, if anything, slightly better. Now, being completely quiet, that is either bad in and of itself, so that would mean if you're quiet for an away shooter, that could actually screw him up a little bit, because you'd be like, wait, what's going on? I can hear my mom on a cell phone, you know? Or it's actually the fact that these people, you're going to disappoint these people. Like you look into some kid's eye on the sideline, and he's about to cry if you miss it. We can't separate the two effects because no home team stays quiet. There's no variation in this. No home team stays quiet for away shooters. So what we'd like to do, any representatives out there, tell your home fans to shut up in clutch moments for away shooters. We'll get a little more data, you know, beautiful. But until then, we can't separate the supportive aspect versus the ambient noise aspect. Another thing I'd like to mention is that home shooters do a little better in non-clutch moments. Is that due to the rim being slightly different? Is that due to being better rested? Is that due to the fact that they practice on that gym a lot more than the away team practices? We can't test that because it's not a factor that varies in our data. So it's just something that we take as given. A lot of times the home court advantage in general is something that we just sort of take as a fixed factor that's hard to explain. That's probably due to a lot of different components. Thank you, good question. Do we have time for, we'll be available afterwards and by our poster, which is over there, but thanks for their time, and thanks to the organizers for doing this game.